So let's jump in. So today's topic is going to be descent with modification and the origin of the species. And so the backdrop for how this idea came to be, as you know, you've probably heard at some point in your life, and you've definitely heard in the previous lecture, that really always started with Charles Darwin, right? This English naturalist, and his views on biology and evolution were formed through essentially his circumnavigation around the globe. So he went from England all the way around South America, all the way over to Asia, down around Africa, and back to England. So he circumnavigated the globe in the 1840s. And he stopped at this really important archipelago, or just set of islands, called the Galapagos Islands. And Darwin just kind of observed things, and that's what Darwin was known for, just kind of looking. And a lot of good science can be derived by just observing. Not all science, but a lot of good science can be derived by just looking. Now, Darwin collected 31 specimens of birds from 3 islands. Now, Darwin himself was not an expert on birds, but he was interested enough in what he saw on those islands that he took them back to England so that someone that was an expert on birds could identify them. And he found that his collection from the Galapagos was closely related to a group of distinct species back from where he was from. And he observed that there was a high degree of homology, so similarity, between all of his finches, his birds that he collected, and they're very similar except for their beaks. And just as a note, Darwin collected X number of species. In total, we now recognize there's 14 species of birds on the Galapagos. But this is what Darwin collected. And again, it's not exactly the most remarkable group of individuals to completely define an entire scientific, I was going to say genre, but that's not quite right, entire scientific way of thinking, but they really do illustrate this idea of natural selection perfectly. And you have this group of species living on this island, right, this archipelago, all descended from one original founding species. So something landed on the Galapagos, or a group of individuals landed on the Galapagos, and they took off population-wise. And what I think is really powerful about this example is you could just see how their beaks differ and how their beaks are really tuned for what they're trying to do, the environment that they're trying to live in. Whether it's a woodpecker finch, has a very narrow beak, but it's using this little device to fish some insects out of this tree. The large ground finch, where it's a bit bulkier, but it has this really monster set of not set, but it's larger beak for cracking large nuts. It's the cactus finch, where it has this hooked beak for digging seeds out of cacti, and so on and so forth. You have this group of individuals living on a standard, a secluded island, and their environment is selecting for the variability in traits that naturally occurs in populations, right? We know that variability is a natural part of biology, right? Variability in populations is a hallmark of a biological population. And it's true of, the finches, it's true of humans, right? When we're together as a group, there's a wide diversity of traits. Now, Darwin, after observing, this idea of, finches having a wide diversity of foods that they eat, he hypothesized that these different beak shapes were simply related to their food gathering habits, and that natural selection, remember this, the environment selecting, had shaped the beaks according to its food source. Now, remember, natural selection isn't like a directed form of evolution. It's not like I want to go here. It's just the environment provides the source, and there's natural variability in the population that gets selected upon by that environmental condition. And so Darwin has a really nice quote, and he says, "One might really fancy that one species has been taken and modified for different ends." And that's really what is going on here, right? You could imagine, like, if you saw this in action, something landed, and the environment was there to select for all these different traits, right? The natural variability in the population was selected upon by the environment. And again, it's not selecting like I went to the market and selected a nice piece of fruit to eat, but it really is, the environment saying, hey, here's all these different habitats. If you have the traits to live in them, you can live there and survive and pass on your genetic information to the next generation. So remember that's the way we think of it, right? It's not like I select you to do this, right? It's not like that. It's the environment has conditions that are better for certain traits. Now, as we sort of alluded at last week, and is sort of a cornerstone of Darwin's thinking, you have to satisfy three conditions for natural selection to really do its thing. So there has to be phenotypic variation in population, so there has to be a diversity of traits. This diversity of traits must lead to differences among individuals in lifetime reproductive success. So if I have a large beak, it has to be beneficial for natural selection to act upon. And then finally, phenotypic variation among individuals must be genetically transmissible. So if I go to the gym and get really buff, that's not genetically transmissible to the next generation, right? So my traits I have to be transmissible to the next generation. So that was Darwin. Now, about 100 years later, we have two scientists, Peter and Rosemary Grant. They're called, I guess you could call them like a power couple. They went to the Galapagos Island, and in particular, they went to an island called Daphne Major. Now, like Darwin, they studied the finches, but they were actually focused on just one type of finch, which was the medium ground finch. And the Grants found, like Darwin, that beak depth varied among members of the population. So beak depth is being how deep the beak is, right? A deeper beak just implies a longer, larger beak. And what they noticed was that average beak depth actually changed from one year to the next in a predictable fashion. And you might go, well, that's kind of cool. Well, I thought evolution was slow. And the reality is evolution can actually be relatively rapid given the right environment. Now, what they saw was that during years with drought, birds with deeper, more powerful beaks survived because they were able to feed on the large seeds that proliferated during droughts. And that normal rains, so just your average everyday year in the Galapagos, average beak depth decreased due to its original size. Because small seeds were favored by higher amounts of water. So you have this environment, drought, which in turn makes seeds larger, favors larger birds, or larger beaks, I should say. But normal rains favor smaller seeds, which in turn favors smaller beaks. So again, it's still the environment, but the environment is kind of doing like a double poke, right? It's poking on seed size, when seed size, which is what feeds the birds, is then poking on beak size. So you kind of have this cool thing. So we can actually physically look at this graphically. So we have year on the x-axis here, and then we have beak depth in millimeters here. And you can see, beak depth, changes, right? There's some variability here, right? You can see that with the error bars, but it's pretty variable, right? As we go from the mid 70s to the 80s, right? It goes up by almost a full millimeter, which might not seem significant, but for your capacity to break a beak, or I'm sorry, to break seeds, it's a significant increase, right? And you can see that it kind of has this wobble, right? And even within a single year, there's still variability of traits. That's important, right? But again, there's this change over a short period of time, and you can see where you're seeing where you have a drought, where larger seeds are becoming more abundant. You see that beak size dramatically increases from one year to the next, and then it kind of holds, and then the drought sort of kind of peters off, and you can see that small seeds are now in turn becoming more abundant again, thus driving down beak size in a similar fashion as we saw when the drought really ramped up. So we have this kind of wiggle. Again, it's all because the environment changes. And you could just plot this just to show, that there is a nice standard relationship here. Mean beak depth on the X, beak depth of offspring on the Y, and you see that as the beak size of the birds making the babies increases, so too does the beak size of their offspring. So this shows us that beak size is inheritable, and it's something that can be selected upon for the environment. So again, a really great example, right? The environment changes their food source, and we know what really changes the beaks in finches is what food source they are eating. So again, a really nice example of how this kind of comes together. Now, moving away from Darwin a little bit, we're actually going to discuss another case, which is actually one of my favorite cases, which is called the peppered moth case. And this is still England, so we're not inducing a lot of diversity in terms of places we're looking at, but that's okay. Now, when the environment itself physically changes, natural selection often favors different traits in a species. Now, the adult moth, or the peppered moth, Biston betularia, I believe that's how you say that. I am not the best with scientific names, but I try my best. Now, this species of moth, comes in a wide range of shapes and shades, more importantly. And the cool thing about this pepper moth, and as we know now, they didn't know that back then, but we do know it now, is that body color was controlled by a single gene. Now, individuals that were black have the dominant allele, and individuals that were white or lighter colored had a recessive allele. Now, being being black in terms of this moth was relatively rare in this population in England in the 1850s. However, for those of you that know anything about history, you'll know that 1850s was the start of the Industrial Revolution, where we started relying less upon manual labor, i.e. animals and humans, and we relied more heavily on the combustion of fossil fuels, coal principally at this time, and oil to an extent, but mostly coal, to power our everyday lives, right? This is when crazy things started to happen, like factories and massive textile manufacturing, and eventually electricity. This is the time period where all that happened. And after the 1850s, when the Industrial Revolution really took over, the frequency increased of the black individuals near industrialized centers to almost 100%. So again, pre-industrial revolution, we have basically very few black individuals in industrial areas and natural areas for that matter, but in particular, we're thinking about industrial areas. After we started combusting coal, we see an increase of black individuals up to essentially 100% of the population. And I think the answer for this one might be either really obvious or you might be scratching your head. But the reality is, what we're getting at here is the combustion of coal changes the environment, and the environment selects on the population. So what was happening? Well, a scientist named J.W. Hutt hypothesized that light-colored moths declined near urban areas because of predation, and I think you can really see this nicely, right? You can see this, non-dark surface where the white moth, right? So this white moth, not totally black like we see here, kind of blends in relatively nicely. We can easily see it because it's a nice close-up picture, but you can imagine if you were a bird, this would be hard to pick out, right? But if you imagine if you were a bird here, this would be pretty easy. This would be pretty easy to pick out, right? Especially on this lighter surface. But we can look at what happens when you start to combust coal. Trees start to look a little bit like this, right? Because coal is dirty, right? It puts lots of particulate in the air, which in turn settles on surfaces. If you need a better visualization than this, you can Google like industrial England in the 1850s, and it's just gross pictures of black skylines and stuff like that. So it's really kind of a gross era. Coal's gross. There's no such thing as clean burning coal, for that matter. But you can see in this industrialized area, white moths stick out like a sore thumb, and the black moths are doing really well. So we have this shift in the environment from here to here, and that in turn puts a pressure. Now, this pressure is not a natural one in like a drought or something like that, but it's a human-induced one, but it still has the same effect, right? We're changing the environment, which selects for different traits. And remember, for the environment to select for different traits, this variability has to exist in the population. If these black individuals didn't exist, well, these white moths would have probably been wiped out from urban centers, but they didn't because natural variability exists. Now, this phenomenon was later given a name. This is what we call industrial melanism. Now, this is a phenomenon by which darker individuals come to predominate over light ones. And I think, again, this example illustrates it nicely, but the idea, pollution makes surfaces darker, which in turn favors darker individuals, right? Now, you can imagine if you cut back on pollution or you implemented some sort of pollution control that would result in bark color being lighter again, well, selection would tell us that it would favor the light colored individuals, and you would be absolutely right, right? If I cut back on essentially how much pollution I'm putting into the environment, it's going to make surfaces lighter, and natural selection tells us that's better for lighter individuals, so the population will skew towards being lighter again. And you can actually physically see this. So the percentage of melanic moths, so essentially black moths, right? What gives moths their color, what gives humans their color is melanism, and that's what melanic means. Now we have the year, in 59 all the way to 2003, and you'll see that, oh shoot, my scale is gone. That's okay. My legend is gone for some reason. I don't know, but we can just focus on the red line because I think the red line really illustrates what we're looking at here. But you'll notice that in the 60s, when pollution control was really poor, there was a high percentage of dark moths, and as we sort of enacted controls, in particular in the 70s is when we really started to get serious about pollution, you notice that there's a dramatic decline in melanic moths, again, simply tied to pollution control, making dark surfaces again lighter, which again, I think this is a really great example. The environment changed. It's selected for different individuals because there is variability in that population. Now, when we switch off the selection force, which is that production of dirty soot, it flips the switch the other way, selecting for lighter individuals, swinging the population to a different state. And that's how selection works. The environment selects. And as we saw with the grants, it can happen fast, right? The grants showed us it took, less than 10 years to completely change the population. With this example here, again, once the selection force was turned off, it didn't take that long, right? 20 to 30 years for the population to completely change. So again, Darwin, as we discussed, Darwin thought selection was a really long-term process, like millions of years. But these two examples show you that if the selection force is strong enough, it can happen really rapidly. And as you know, we'll talk about, in a couple classes, we'll talk about microorganisms, and we'll talk about how they evolve really fast. But again, this evolution is not just a long-term process. It can act rapidly. Selection can act rapidly. Now, just as a note, I would be remiss if I didn't make mention of this. Now, Tutt, who came up with this idea of industrial melanism, his hypothesis is actually being reevaluated. Now, there's some interesting data nowadays where there's recent selection against melanism actually doesn't appear to correlate with changes in the abundance of light color lichens. So you're gonna learn about lichens in 4 classes or something like that. What people are seeing for lichens, these fungi, is actually the opposite pattern. So there's actually some little bit of back and forth between this idea of what Tutt saw and what we're seeing with lichen and what actually is the causative agent here. So I feel like I just wanted to put that out there just so you know. If you ever Google it, you'll be like, oh, why did Dr. Kearns tell me this was a thing when these lichen don't do it? But again, there's always some back and forth in science. But the idea of selection, again, the driving force might not be the correct one, but it's certainly the idea of selection is there. So now, what Tutt was observing is typically what we coin as being artificial selection, and this is change initiated by humans. Now, and this could be direct or indirect. Now, Tutt's example was indirect, right? We were just burning coal because that's what we do. But we can also have a targeted form of artificial selection where we physically and directly select for the traits that we want, thus forcing individuals to pass those down to the next generation. So if you think of racehorses, right? Racehorses are a great example of that. We select for the traits we want in those, forcing them to mate with other horses that have the similar traits, thus passing those down to the next generation. So that's the type of selection we're thinking about. Now, there's also experimental selection, which is a pretty cool one, where you can force individuals to evolve in a laboratory setting. So there's, when we talk about microbes, I'll talk a little bit about a really cool experiment with E. coli that's been evolving for decades. But you can also do it with Drosophila melanogaster, which is a fruit fly. You can do it with other bacteria. You can do it with worms. There's any number of things where you can experimentally evolve individuals within a laboratory setting. And you could sort of see this data for what's happening for bristle number in Drosophila. Kind of a cool thing where you can select for things just by being in the correct laboratory setting, inducing selection in the lab. So, and then my favorite type of selection actually, and this is my favorite example, is actually agricultural selection. And this is why we have all the foods we like today. So when you go to the store and you buy a banana, or you buy a mango, or you buy an apple, or you buy corn, why they all kind of look the same, why they all look, tasty and all that fun stuff, is because of agricultural selection, where we as individuals, since the advent of agriculture about, I don't know, say about 10,000 years ago, selected for traits in wild plants that led us to domesticate them and able to grow them in agricultural fields, right? And my favorite example of this is actually teosinte. Now, teosinte, as you can probably tell, is the wild ancestor of modern corn. And teosinte, it's pretty unremarkable, right? It's only about 3 inches tall, and the biggest modern corns can actually be close to 16 inches long. They're average, about 8 or 9 inches, but they can be up to 16 inches long, which is a huge corn. But you can see how dramatic agricultural selection is. We started with this really unremarkable plant. We select for traits we want over time. There's this gradual change over time, leading to the modern corn that we know and potentially love, right? So that's one type, but you can also see it across a wide range of our animals in an agricultural setting, whether it's pigs or chickens, even duck, for example, cows. Any number of traits you can think of in an agricultural setting come from agricultural selection, and it's kind of a cool thing, right? We take these traits we know exist in the wild, right? These, you could potentially think of them as mutants, and we select for them over time, leading for transformations like this. Again, my favorite example of being teosinte. If you ever want to know what wild lettuce looks like, that's also a fantastic transition story. I don't know if you guys remember those like 10-year challenge things that were from a couple years ago. Like you put a picture of yourself from 10 years ago and you put a picture of yourself now. I think 10-year challenge for teosinte versus modern corn would be a fantastic comparison as well. But that's just me. Now, domestication, which is also a type of agricultural selection, but we don't eat many of the things that we have domesticated, but we do impose selection across a wide variety of animals: cats, dogs, pigeons, pigs as well, horses, right? We domesticate things that we don't eat. Now, some domestication events occur because we want them for specific things. So, for instance, greyhounds were domesticated for running, dachshunds were domesticated for badger pursuits, in case you didn't know that. And there's a wide variety of, like for instance, English pointer dogs were for hunting. There's all sorts of, reasons why we have domesticated certain breeds of dogs. But you can look at the wild ancestor of dogs and you can see how dramatically things have changed, right? Whether it's a mastiff, a dachshund, or even the kind of the odd chihuahua, right? And if you want to sort of see the most extreme example of domestication, you can see what, you can think of something like a pug, or you can think of something like an English bulldog, where we selected through time, not for any particular reason other than we thought it looked cute, these really sort of narrow faces, right? The dogs kind of look like they ran face first into a wall. I'm not poking at those dog breeds, but that's just kind of what they look like, right? And so we selected for these extreme traits that existed naturally in populations for our own benefit, right? Because we think they look cute, right? But again, started with the population, the wild population, wolves. We domesticated them, looking for traits that were beneficial for us. And they might not be for like hunting. They might just be for cuteness, or they might be because they're really, really small, as in like a chihuahua. So now, domestication can also lead to some unintentional selection of some traits. Now, a key hallmark of domestication is actually selection for behavioral traits. So making them more docile, right? A wild wolf, you definitely wouldn't want to have as a pet because they're untamed, right? But you can have any modern dog species and they're pretty tame, right? Now, we can actually look at a really interesting example. So we can look at silver foxes. They they tried to domesticate silver foxes, and they're pretty cute, right? I mean, they're foxes are pretty cute individuals. Now, what they did was actually choose the most docile animals, and within 40 years of breeding, the animals became docile, but they actually found that they had many of the same physical traits as domestic dogs, which is kind of cool, right? So wolves gave rise to dogs, but when we tried to domesticate foxes, which are relatively closely related to wolves, we were actually seeing a similar push, right, in terms of physical characteristics. So we can actually see that maybe some traits are for behavior, i.e. being docile, is potentially linked to other traits, right? And so in a genetic context, we would actually call this pleiotrophy, right? Or potentially calling linkage, but it's most likely pleiotrophy, where a gene that controls behavior also controls some physical traits, right? Because you can imagine being a docile individual, you might want to have cute puppy eyes, right? That's a beneficial trait to have together. So that's domestication. Now, the question I hope that's all sort of kind of bouncing around in the back of your heads is, okay, we've talked about selection, but can selection produce major evolutionary changes? And the answer is yes. Clearly, the answer is yes. And we'll talk about some of these, but we we know that domestication, we know that selection can induce major changes in populations in short and long periods of time. Now, the vast majority of scientists think that natural selection is the sole process responsible for evolutionary changes, that there's nothing else out there. When we look at the fossil record and we see change over time, the only way to explain that is natural selection, is the theory of evolution. There's nothing else. Now, there are some critics, and their voices are relatively few in the scientific community because, again, this is a well-accepted theory, but some critics do accept that selection can lead to changes within a species, but not the substantial changes documented in the fossil record. And so that is a thing. Figured I'd just put that out there. However, we will mention that this argument actually doesn't fully appreciate the extent of change produced by something like artificial selection. Now, we can look at 10,000 years of history of human history, and we can see actually just how dramatically we've changed dogs in that time period. Right? We started domesticating dogs about 8,000 years ago, and if we actually dug up fossils of dogs and say, 100 years from now, and we didn't know what dogs were, we would actually say that, a pit bull is a different dog species than a pug, right? That's how we would interpret that. We know they're all not, we know they're all the same exact species, but from a fossil record standpoint, all dogs would be considered, all dog breeds, I should say, would be considered different species if we found them as fossils with no record of that dogs were just all different breeds as opposed to completely different species. So selection is a huge acting force, and we can see it in fossil records. And fossil records are inherently incomplete. It's just the way it is. But fossils, as I'm sure many of you know, are simply preserved remains of once living organisms. And three conditions have to be satisfied for fossilization to occur. The organisms have to be buried in sediment, calcium or bone, the calcium in the bone, and other hard tissues, so like cartilage and things like that, sometimes feathers, has to mineralize, i.e. turn to rock. And the surrounding sediment has to also harden and form into rock. So those three conditions have to occur for fossilization to happen. And we can actually make things fossilize in modern times. Like you can artificially fossilize things, just as a note. But fossilization as a general property is relatively rare. It depends on who you ask, but some people estimate it's about a 1 in 1 million chance for any individual ever that has existed to fossilize. Some people say it's rarer, some people say it's more common, but the average is about 1 in 1 million chance. So it's not particularly very common, which explains why we have so many holes in our fossil records. Now, we can estimate the age of fossils, which is kind of a cool thing. And Darwin say rocks were actually dated by their position relative to one another. So it was kind of imprecise dating. They were like, oh, this is near this rock, and this one's about this number of years old, thus these all have to be the same. That was their sort of thought process there. So clearly not the most accurate thing. But modern geologists, they determine the absolute age of rocks by using isotopic dating. which is a really cool technique. So the most common, the two of the most common elements that they use are potassium and carbon. Now, for things that are super duper old, they use uranium, but potassium and carbon are typically the two we use the most to date fossils and remains of organisms. Now, potassium has isotopes, and so thinking back to chemistry, isotope is just simply an atom that has extra neutrons. Now, atoms that have extra neutrons actually decay over time. They lose mass over time. Right? They shed parts of the nucleus over time. Now, shedding for a group of atoms to shed its half of its weight, or I'm sorry, half of its what's the word I'm looking for here? Half of its neutrons over time. That's what I said. For a given group of atoms for half of them to shed an extra neutron over time. For potassium, that takes about 1.25 billion years. And for more recent events, we actually use carbon. Carbon has an isotope of carbon-14. The half-life of a population of carbon to shed its neutron to become carbon-13 is about 5,700 years. So we have these two ways to date modern for carbon and really, really old things for potassium. And this is what we can look at, right? So we have some sort of event that's happened a long time ago. And so this is the proportion of parent isotope remaining. And this is the number of half-lives. So remember, half-life is half of the population to lose their extra neutron, right? So we start off with 100% of the population being a isotope. Then a half-life, which is X number of years later, half of the population has shed its neutron. Another half-life, so it would be a quarter of the total of the original population, and then another half-life, and then another half-life. And we can use so we know that there's a natural abundance in the environment for these isotopes. And so we can look at fossils and the abundance of these isotopes in the fossils to use this type of curve to date a fossil. So if a fossil has very, very little potassium, so an isotope of potassium, we would assume that it's somewhere in between here. So if it has 1/16 of the amount of potassium we would expect, well, we would assume it's gone through 4 half-lives, and a half-life for potassium is about 1 billion years. So we would assume that fossil is about 4 billion years or so. So that's the kind of the thinking we use. As we lose those isotopes relative to what we know they should exist, they get older and older and older. And so you can derive equations to estimate based upon the percentages. That's kind of how they do it. So that's how we date fossils. It's a science that is very, very accurate. And there's not a lot of bad things about fossil dating. As a scientific technique, it is sound, provided that the scientists that are doing it know what they're doing. Just doesn't know. So if anyone ever tells you that fossil dating is inaccurate, that's just simply not true. Carbon dating, potassium dating, they're all very, very accurate. So in the scientific community, there's no doubts as to how accurate isotope-based dating is, just as a note. Now, back to the fossil record. We can use the fossil record to look at what we call evolutionary transition. Now, remember, likelihood of fossil preservation is low. So there is gaps in the fossil record. So we don't see this perfect transition, right? We don't see how, the ancestor of chimpanzees and us evolved over time through the fossil record to produce chimpanzees and us. That's just not how the fossil records work. However, the fossil record has enough information that we can actually start to see some intermediates between modern day individuals and our extinct ancestors. Now, I'm going to give you a couple examples of this, but one of my favorites is actually the oldest known bird fossil, which is the individual called Archaeopteryx. And it's a clear intermediate between bird and dinosaur. Now, this is what Archaeopteryx fossils look like. Now, for those of you that didn't know, or maybe you just are in denial because it's weird to think of dinosaurs as birds, but dinosaurs are birds based on on what we know about them. And why we have chickens nowadays is because dinosaurs existed in the past, which is kind of a lame evolutionary transition, right? Going from Tyrannosaurus rex to chicken. but that's the way it is. But you can see Archaeopteryx as an individual. It's got feathers, as you can clearly see in its fossils, and it's relatively large as an individual, and it's got characteristics that resemble dinosaurs, and it's got characteristics that resemble birds. So it's kind of this cool intermediate, right? Dinosaurs being cool and mighty, birds being kind of meh, relative, of course, relative to dinosaurs, I should say, not just because birds are meh, just because dinosaurs are awesome. And then we have Archaeopteryx, which kind of sits in the middle, where it's half bird, half dinosaur. So again, this is why Archaeopteryx is pretty cool. Now, when we think about this intermediate, right, or whether it's Archaeopteryx or some other things I'm going to show you in just a moment, they don't have all the traits, right? They don't have intermediate traits, right? These intermediate fossils exhibit some traits of their ancestors, some of their descendants. Now, what does that look like? Well, we could look at something like a four-legged aquatic mammal, right? So a mammal that lives in water but has legs, right? So that would be the transition between living in the land and living in the sea. We could see snakes with legs, right? So snakes we know don't have legs, but you could think of maybe in the past, snakes had legs and they lost them over time. There's a organism called the Tiktaalik. I think that's how you pronounce it. As you guys have figured out at this point, I'm bad at pronouncing names, but it's this species that essentially bridge the gap between fish and first amphibians. And oysters also have intermediate fossils as well. But you can start to think about these intermediates, right? You could think of modern toothed whales. So, the orca is a great example, and their ancestor that had, similar skeletal structure, similar body shape, but had more, this extra pair of limbs here, right? So this intermediate, right, where selection is selecting for these traits. They're changing, but they're not quite gone as we observe them in modern times, right? If this is the whale's ancestor, you can see the traits are similar, right? Similar tails. There's no dorsal fin yet, but back here, but you see it eventually evolves. You see the skull is different, right? The fins are differently shaped, but again, it has the hallmarks of the modern individual, but its selection hasn't gotten rid of or changed the traits enough so that it resembles the modern living ancestor. And we could see this again with it goes in the land and it goes in the water, so it's kind of this hybrid, right? It's got fins, but it's got legs, and then you could see a modern, maybe not a modern, but a more modern than this version where it has full legs, not swimming anymore, fully living on land. But again, you can see the homology here, right? The similarity. Characteristics are similar, but they're changed because the environment is selecting for them, right? If you're going to live on land, you want to look like this. You don't want to look like this, right? That's the idea. So now, the fossil record is inherently incomplete, right? If the fossil record was perfect, we would be able to see these changes over time, and evolution would be a great field. But we don't. The fossil record is spotty. But we can actually use some pretty well-preserved evolutionary transitions to actually look and see how evolution changes things over time. And one of the best examples of evolutionary transitions is actually the horse. So horses belong to the family Equidae. I'm sure you guys have probably heard that horses are equines, right? So their family is Equidae. Now, modern horses are large, they're long-legged, and they're fast-running, adapted to life on grasslands. However, the first horse was small with short legs, and they preferred wooded and woodland-based habitats. Now, the path from this little tiny horse that likes to live in the forest to the modern, potentially monstrous horses that we see, needed a couple things. We need changes in size, the reduction of toes, as you'll see that in a second, as well as changes in tooth size and shape, and as well as adaptations to the changes in the climate. And I don't mean this as climate change as in like modern climate change. I just mean that there's climate changes, and you have to adapt to the changing climate. So let's look at what this looks like. And again, a really fantastically preserved evolutionary set of transitions. And you can see the ancestor here and the modern version of the horse here. And you'll notice that the only one that makes it to modern times, in terms of, what's still living is the modern horse, right? We don't have any other different types of horses out there. Now you can see the foot here on the left and the hoof on the right, and you see how that dramatically changes, right? We start at modern day horses, they kind of look like, like a sledgehammer, right? They're straight, they're hard, and the tooth shape, again, it's flat and large. That's not bottom of the hoof, I'm sorry. It's tooth shape, sorry. And you see the body size is big. And you can see as over time how the hoof changes, right? It starts off being this multi-toed thing that was great for walking in the forest. As they moved into different environments, as the climate changed, their feet changed to the modern day horse that we see. You can see the same thing for tooth, right? Small, sort of more akin to what we see for our molars, designed for eating different types of leaves, and they changed as they changed the different types of leaves, eventually moving to grass, leading to the type of teeth that you would need to grind grass up. And you can also see the changes in size, right? Modern horses are huge, ancestral horses are tiny. And this is horse diversity. Now, it's actually kind of cool, right? It's not a huge number of species, but the evolutionary transitions are relatively clear, and they happen on, you're thinking on a 60 million year timescale. And in terms of, human thinking, 60 million years is a long time, right? The dinosaurs went extinct 5 million years before horses became a thing. But on a planetary scale, remember, this planet is about 4.5 billion years old. 65 million years is a blink of an eye in that time period. So again, it might seem like a long time it took, but actually not a super duper long time. So, but again, nice clear evolutionary transition. And at its peak, there was actually 13 genera of horse living simultaneously in North America alone. So lots of diversity of horses, lots of things that have gone extinct. But again, you can see the evolutionary transitions from ancestor to modern time. Now, that's the fossil record, but we can actually use anatomical evidence in living things to actually provide some evidence for evolution, provide evidence for what selection is doing to populations. Now, homologous structures, homologous just meaning similar structures, we can actually see them across different species, even if they're not closely related. And so we can actually look at the bones of the forelimb of mammals as great evidence for homologous structures, because they have, what the idea behind homologous structures is that they might have different functions nowadays, but the ancestor of all the things living have the same, would have had the same ancestral structure. So let me show you what I mean by that. So we have the humans, cats, bats, marine mammal, and horse, all mammals, right? Bats being the only flying ones, and they all have the same structure: humerus, radius, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, phalanges, and you can see that exact same bone structure across all species. Now, they're highlighted so it's easy to pick out, but this idea of this set of 6 types of bones being the base would have been something that was present in the ancestor to all of these mammals. Because remember, when we think about a group that exists now, as we go back in time, they were all at one point evolved from a small subset of ancestors. And these ancestors, given the homology of bones here, actually would have had to had the same exact bone structures, the same suite of 6 bone types. Now, clearly humans and cats and birds and marine mammals and horses all have different structures now because they have different environments that they live in. Marine mammals' bones look like this. They've taken the ancestral state and changed it because they live in the water. Bats, they fly, so they have to change it. That's an adaptation for flying. Humans, we're bipedal. We grab things. We've adapted things for our lifestyle. Cats, horses, same thing. The environment selected for the traits that we that are already existing within the population. So that's homologous structures. It's kind of, again, pretty cool. Now we also see, and this is my favorite type of homology, it's actually embryonic development. Now this is actually some of the strongest evidence for evolution, and we can actually compare how organisms develop. We're really good at that. You can actually compare the embryos of modern day vertebrates, and you can actually see there's a severely high degree of homology. And the only way that homology essentially exists is if we all shared a common ancestor, right? So things like this don't happen, it doesn't happen by chance, right? For us to all be animals, to all be vertebrates, we had a common ancestor at some point. Now, some traits, some structures are really, really successful. So evolution keeps them and changes them slightly depending on the environment. So let's look at what this looks like. Now, um, this is the development of a amphibian. That's the word I'm looking for. But you'll notice that this amphibian is not all that different than actually a human developing at that same point would be. So humans at this exact same developmental point don't look all that different from this amphibian. We have the same vertebrate. We actually have we have slits for gills. We have similar eyes and head structures, and we also have tails and similar appendages. So humans actually look a lot like amphibians, reptiles, during early stages of development. And again, the only way that comes to be is if there was some sort of developmental plan in an ancestor that we all shared, and it was slightly changed over time. Again, really cool. I didn't put the cool pictures of this, but if you want to look at embryonic homology, there's so many cool pictures out there, just as a note. So now, evolution, as I've mentioned, is not directed, right? It doesn't say, I'm going to make the perfect organism. And that's not the goal of evolution. Evolution with natural selection says, here's the environment selects for traits. It's not directed, right? It's not like domestication where we select for exactly the traits we want, right? So evolution does produce lots of imperfections where some organisms simply do not appear perfectly adapted to the environment. Now they have workable solutions, but natural selection, remember, has to act on what's available. So if the perfect solution for the environment is not present in your population, natural selection doesn't have the capacity to act upon that, right? You need the traits to act upon, right? That's the bottom line. You can't have traits come out of nowhere. The traits have to be there for evolution selection. Now, animals that have very long necks actually typically have many vertebrae for flexibility. So we see geese have 25 vertebrae. Plesiosaurs have 76, right? Plesiosaurs being dinosaurs. And mammals only have 7, which is not such a big deal with humans. But when you think about a giraffe, which sometimes can have a 20-foot long neck, they have only 7 vertebrae too. Now, there was no evolutionary background in mammals to select for 25 vertebrae, just the 7 vertebrae. So what have giraffes done to make it so that they can eat leaves and have a 20-foot long neck? Well, they simply just increase the size of those 7 vertebrae. Because mammals only have 7 vertebrae, there is simply no way for natural selection to select for an individual with 15 vertebrae or 25 vertebrae or even 8 vertebrae, right? The mammal body plan only has 7 vertebrae. So what did natural selection do instead? Instead of selecting for more vertebrae, which simply was not present in ancestral mammals, they selected for individuals that have larger vertebrae. Those with larger vertebrae were able to have longer necks, able to eat different food sources, and thus have a better reproductive success for passing on their traits to the next generation, thus leading to the giraffe. So again, not evolution, again, it's not always perfect, but it makes do with what it has. And if the environment has some available area, organisms will potentially rise to fill that. So again, evolution is not directed, it's not perfect, but it makes do with the traits that are present. It's not very often that a brand new trait pops up in a population. So it does what it can. Now, eyes are another great example of this. Now, in the eyes of vertebrates, photoreceptors are actually face backwards, which is kind of weird, right? So you would imagine that, if you're trying to sense color and light, you would want your photoreceptors facing forward. But that's not actually the way our eyes are made. So we can actually look at, our nerve fibers here, light comes in, there's all this stuff that happens, and the photoreceptor cells, which accept the light signal and turn it into, brain action, are facing backwards. And that's just the way our eyes were. Now, mollusks, on the other hand, as you can see here, their photoreceptors actually face forward. And so mollusks, clams and mussels and things like that, they're actually more optimally designed with no obstructing blind spot. So they basically can see everything, whereas we can only see a limited number of things. And again, this is because the ancestor for the eyes of vertebrates face the opposite direction. Because there was no real variability in that, it still exists in modern times. So kind of a fun example, right? Your eyes aren't perfect, they're great, and evolution has made do, but it could be better, right? We could be like mollusks and have super duper vision. Now, we could also look at what's called vestigial structures, and these are remnants from our ancestors that simply don't function anymore, right? Now, humans have many such examples of this. For instance, some of us have relatively long tailbones, right? Our ancestors had tails, but humans also have muscles for wiggling our ears. I can wiggle my ears pretty well, which my cousins always liked when I was growing up, but it doesn't really serve me any purpose, right? Wiggling my ears doesn't do anything. It doesn't help me hear better or anything like that. Now, boa constrictors, if you looked at their skeleton, they actually have hip bones and rudimentary hind legs. It serves them no function, but their ancestor had legs. And manatees, which is my favorite example, actually have fingertips. So if you guys haven't seen a manatee, they're called sea cows. This is what they look like. They're marine mammals. Now manatees actually have fingertips on their fins, their front fins here. Clearly they don't need fingers. They don't have fingers, but they still have fingertips. So this is an example of a vestigial structure. Their ancestor had fingers, and evolution has changed those fingers into fins, but the fingertips still remain. And again, I love this example because manatees are just cool individuals, but I love the idea of this 1,500-pound individual with these big old fins still having fingernails. So that's fun. Now, at a genetic level, we can actually see similar things. Now, in your genome, you have what are called pseudogenes. Now, pseudogenes are essentially fossilized genes, where they're vestigial genes, where they're traces of previously functioning genes. Now, when a trait disappears from a population, the gene itself just doesn't vanish from thin air. It takes a really, really long time to get rid of a gene from your genome. So these are what we call pseudogenes, genes that used to produce traits, but the traits are now gone from the population, but the genetic information for that gene still largely exists in your gene, but it's non-functional. So for example, icefish, which as their name implies, live in Arctic and Antarctic waters, they have colorless blood that simply does not contain hemoglobin. However, their DNA contains pseudogenes that are non-functional hemoglobin genes. Why is that? Well, they didn't just pick up this gene from the environment. Their ancestor had to have had hemoglobin genes, and because their environment selected against hemoglobin, they lost the capacity to produce it, but they still have the genetic remnants in their genome. And you can see what an icefish looks like. They're kind of alien looking. They're cool though. They're clear. They have coloration, but again, they don't have hemoglobin containing blood. Their blood doesn't quite look like ours. So cool, really cool example of that. And the human genome is chock full of pseudogenes. You could, if you go to Google and you type in human pseudogenes, you'll get a list of hundreds and hundreds of really interesting functions that we used to have, but we simply don't have anymore. And that's the same for every species on the planet, whether it's a microorganism or whether it's the biggest animals on the planet. Everything has pseudogenes in their genome because it's hard to get rid of a gene from your genome. It really is. So once it's there, it might lose function, but it's going to hang around for an extended period of time. Now, we can actually study evolution and natural selection through a process called biogeography. And its name kind of tells you what it is. Bio meaning life, geography meaning, like area, right? Maps and all that fun stuff, right? So biogeography is simply the study of the distribution of species across the planet. And biogeography itself reveals many really interesting things, but importantly for evolution, it reveals that different geographical areas sometimes exhibit groups of plants and animals and microorganisms too, that are strikingly similar in appearance, even though the organisms are very distantly related. So, what does this imply? Well, it implies that natural selection potentially favors what we call parallel evolution or parallel evolutionary adaptations in similar environments. So, the example I could give you for this, and just off the just as a quick example, is if you have a desert environment, cacti exist in the American Southwest, so the Chihuahuan Desert, and they also exist in the Gobi Desert in China. Different areas of the world, different similar evolutionary traits popping up. Because why? The environment is very similar between the Chihuahuan Desert in the American Southwest and the Gobi Desert in China. Thus, natural selection will select for traits that help you in those similar environments. Now, this leads us to another idea, which we call convergent evolution, where similar forms evolve in different yet isolated areas because of the similar selective pressures in environments. So again, that's the cacti evolving in the Gobi Desert and in the American Southwest. Now, we can actually see this in marsupials and placental mammals. Now, marsupials are only found in Australia. However, Australian marsupials resemble placental mammals found on other continents. So marsupials evolved in Australia, but the selection pressures were similar in Australia and elsewhere, thus leading to similar structures, similar functions. And we can actually see this. So we can look at the marsupials in Australia, and we can look at placental mammals elsewhere, and you can see whether it's the thylacine, whether it's a flying flanger, or it's a marsupial mole, there are similar, distinct, but similar animals found in other places. Remember, Australia is an island way off all on its own. It's very isolated. So we can have convergent evolution where traits evolve because similar environments exist in very, very geographically distinct areas. And the wolf and the thylacine are a great example. They're large well, the wolf is larger, but they're large predators. They hunt, forward-facing eyes. All these characteristics are similar, even though they evolved independently and very far apart from one another. So that's convergent evolution. We can also see this in our marine mammals. We can also see it in fish. Now, this is convergent evolution among fast-moving marine predators. So we see this in sharks. We see this in tuna, both fish. We see this also in the extinct ichthyosaur. So, thinking something that lived back in the dinosaurs. And we can also see this in dolphins, which are mammals. So we see it in dinosaurs, we see it in mammals, and we see it in fish. Evolutionary speaking, they're very distantly related, but they all live in similar environments. They all do very similar things. So they all evolved a similar body plan that maximizes the hydrodynamics of moving through water. Again, similar body shapes, different evolutionary histories, different environments, but selecting for similar things because it helps you be a fast-moving marine predator. Again, really cool, right? I think it's really cool. Now, Darwin himself actually used biogeography. Now, on his voyage, Darwin noted a couple things. Now, islands were often missing plants and animals that were common on continents, but could live there if they were introduced. So if I took a pine tree and dumped it on an island that didn't have pine trees, well, the pine tree could probably live there. Now, species present on islands often diverge from their continental relatives. So we have a slightly new piece of terminology here, which we call a niche or niche. You can call it either which one you want. I prefer niche. I think niche sounds weird, but both are, they mean the same thing. Now, a niche is simply the breadth of environmental conditions that an organism occupies. So my niche as an individual is, I have my house, I have my work, I have the stores that I go to, I have the foods that I eat. That's my niche. And that's the same thing for animals. If, an eagle has its places it lives, it has the foods it hunts, it has the places it sleeps, that's a niche. All the things that an animal essentially can do. Now, species present on islands occupy niches used by other species on continents. So, the niche might be fulfilled on the continent, but it's wide open on an island, thus something can occupy it. And island species are actually usually mostly closely related to species on nearby continents. So what's living on the Galapagos is actually relatively close related to what's living on the mainland of South and Central America. It's the same thing for the Boston Harbor Islands. What lives there, it's evolutionary similar to what's living in the Boston area. Same thing for anything, whether it's Hawaii or any island, they're similar. Now, based on what Darwin saw and based on what I just told you, you can conclude a couple different things. Now, many islands have never been connected to the mainland, and that would be if there's completely unique species living there, and that the islands arrive, I'm sorry, the species that live on islands arrive by dispersing across the water. So they fly there, they get carried there by a storm, or they get carried there by a piece of wood or something like that. And they essentially, the dispersal from nearby sources, i.e. a continent, is more likely than something from very far away. So again, think about, a species dispersing from Boston to the Boston Harbor Islands is much more likely than a species dispersing from California all the way to Hawaii, right? So the closer you are, the more likely you are to disperse to an island. Species that can fly, float, or swim are actually more likely to inhabit islands. So birds and other things that can swim really well or float really well are really likely to be found on islands. And once they do colonize, they evolve into many species. Now, we saw that with the finches, right? The finches live on mainland. They can fly, thus they can make it to the islands. Once they made it to the islands, they've now evolved into completely different species. Now, Darwin has critics. Every piece of scientific idea out there has critics. But as a note, Darwin is completely and almost universally accepted by biologists. There's very few people that work in biology that say evolution isn't real. It would be really hard to find a biologist that doesn't believe in evolution, but they do exist. However, there are lots of controversies around evolution in the general public, and there are 7 principal objections to evolution I'll just make mention of. So people like to say evolution is just a theory. It's not solidly demonstrated, and that's, as we know, that's just simply not true. A theory in a scientific context is something that has a crap ton of evidence behind it. So, a theory that's really well is essentially universally accepted is gravity. And remember, a theory is a big deal in evolution. Just because it's a theory of evolution, that doesn't mean anything. There are no fossil intermediates. Well, we do know that there's holes in the fossil record, and that's true. But that doesn't mean that evolution is not true as a whole. People also argue that intelligent design is a thing, that evolution itself is too random and complex. And intelligent design means it was, species were created by a deity. There's no evidence for that either. But we do know natural selection is something that's not random, but it's also not directed. So it doesn't quite fit with what we see. Intelligent design doesn't quite fit with what we see in nature. Now, people also argue that evolution violates the second law of thermodynamics, which is something we're not going to dive too much into, but the second law does state that things become more disorganized over time in a closed system. So if you have a completely closed system, well, things become more disorganized over time. But the reality is the Earth is not a closed system, so the second law of thermodynamics doesn't really apply to evolution in this context. People also argue that proteins are too improbable, and they argue that, for instance, that the probability of hemoglobin as a random event is 1/20 to the 141st. So it's not really common, right? And it's kind of hard to argue backwards, right? We know hemoglobin exists, but it's hard to argue backwards, right? What's the probability of hemoglobin happening? It's kind of hard to argue that way. So just as a note. Natural selection itself doesn't imply evolution. You can also make the argument, because people like to say, no scientist has ever evolved a fish into a frog. And we actually know that's just not true. Artificial selection has produced different species more distinct than those between wild species, right? Look at dogs, look at corn, look at lettuce. We know that simply is just not true. And I think finally, the irreducible complexity argument, people argue that the intricate machinery of the cell cannot be explained by the evolution from simpler stages. And actually, we know that's just not true. You can actually see cellular intermediates in modern day living things. And natural selection can act on complex systems. So there's lots of critics of this, but again, science overwhelmingly supports natural selection. It overwhelmingly supports evolution. So again, when I say that nothing in biology makes sense without evolution, it's really true. The complexity of life as we know it couldn't exist without natural selection. And natural selection and evolution being the only thing we have scientific evidence for. You as a person can believe whatever you want about how life came to be and all that stuff, but from a evidence-based perspective, all we know today exists because of natural selection and evolution. And that's what science supports. Now, we've been talking about this idea of species, right? Humans are a species, dogs are a species, but what is a species? What is the nature of species? How do we define what a species is? And for a species to be a thing, we actually have to account for two distinct phenomena. The first being the distinctiveness of a species that occur together in a single locality. And second, the connection that exists among different populations belonging to the same species. So those becomes clear what I mean by those in a second, but let's dive into some ideas here. Now, we'll look at what's called a sympatric species. Now, these are species occurring together in an area. So a dog and a cat occurring together in the same area. That's what I mean by sympatric species. Now, these are distinct entities. They're phenotypically different. They utilize different parts of the habitat, and they behave separately. Now, if they look similar to us, different species, even if they look very similar to us, different species usually exhibit great differences in the organisms themselves can tell one another apart. Now, the cat and dog example is a bad example, but think about, if you go out to the Boston Common and you see 10 different species of birds, they all look kind of similar to us, but they're phenotypically different, and whether or not we notice it or not, they're using different parts of the Boston Common, and they behave very differently, and like us, have the capacity to distinguish one from another. Now, species have geographic variation, so within a given species, individuals within populations that occur in different areas may be distinct from one another. Now, you could think of birds. The birds, for instance, pigeons, look very different in the city, but when you take a pigeon and it lives in the suburbs or it lives in a wild area, it becomes to resemble more of a dove, right? Same species, doves and pigeons are the same species, different geographic areas, different phenotypically, which is pretty cool, right? So different species. Now we can also, just give you an example of this, we can look at, oh shoot, I just completely dropped the name of this snake from the top of my brain. The species of snake, which I cannot remember, I'm sorry, you can look at its distribution. The black version lives from Massachusetts all the way down to South Carolina. The yellow version lives along the coast. The red version lives in, Georgia and parts of Florida, and the gray version lives in mostly Georgia, but parts of Florida in the Panhandle. Same species, different phenotypically, but again, same species, and also different environments. So those two ideas lead us to Ernest Mayr, who defined what we call the biological species concept. Now, Ernest Mayr said groups, the species concept, and species being defined as groups of organisms that are actually or potentially interbreeding, which are reproductively isolated from other such groups. So not the craziest definition, right? I don't know if you're expecting something wild and wacky to distinguish between species, but it really isn't. If you can live in the same area, that's one thing, but your capacity to interbreed defines you as a species. So, and when I say interbreed, I mean producing viable offspring, which in turn can then go on to make offspring of their own. So we're very, very similar to chimpanzees, but if for some reason someone had intercourse with a chimpanzee, we could not produce viable offspring. And thus, we are different species. So species themselves are composed of populations whose members mate with one another and produce fertile offspring. Now, populations can exist at small scales. So you can think of the population of Fisher, larger scales like the population of Massachusetts, or the global scale as in the human population. It just depends on how you define a population. Now, this also leads to this idea of reproductive isolation. where we don't mate with one another or we don't produce fertile offspring. Again, that's the boundary for the biological species concept. Now, the biological species concept focuses solely on the capacity to exchange genes. Remember, that's all life is all about, right? You exist not to go to school and cure cancer or anything. From a biological standpoint, you exist to grow up, mate, and pass your genes on to the next generation. That's really all biology tells you you should do. Now, humans do all sorts of stuff because we're humans, but that's all anything else in this world does. Grow up, mate, and pass your genes on to the next generation. So that's what biology is all about. Now, there are two barriers that we can observe that prevent species, so distinct species, from passing their genes to one another, i.e. mating. And these two barriers include prezygotic mating isolation, which basically mechanisms that prevent the formation of a zygote, or remember a zygote just meaning a fertilized egg. So that's fun. And then we have postzygotic mechanisms, which simply tell us that mechanisms that prevent the proper functioning of an egg or a zygote once they form. So nothing crazy, but that's sort of the two main ways that prevent things. Now, prezygotic mechanisms include ecological isolation, so we don't inhabit the same areas. Behavioral isolation, where we do different mating rituals. It's pretty common. Temporal isolation, where we're say like, this bird species produces offspring in the summer, and this bird species produces offspring in the winter. Thus, there's no time overlap for them to make babies. And then finally, mechanical isolation, where our genitals simply don't match up. Like, for instance, insects are great at this, and marine mammals as well. There are differences between species because the shape of one species' penis is different than the shape of another species' penis. That's what we mean by mechanical isolation. I know it's kind of a weird thing to think about, but that's a thing in nature. So now, postzygotic mechanisms typically are typically preventing the fusion of gametes. So when sperm meets egg, if you are postzygote, if you are separated by species, the sperm of a dog simply cannot fertilize the sperm of a cat, naturally speaking. They could in a lab, but naturally speaking, it couldn't happen. And we also leads to what we call hybrid inviability or infertility. So if you produce a hybrid between a cat and a dog, well, that hybrid that you've produced is inviable, so it just dies before it can develop, or it's infertile, thus it can't pass on genes to the next generation. So these are our different types. These are the things I just went through, just basically in a nice handy dandy table format for you to view at your leisure. Now, ecological isolation is an interesting phenomena. Now, Tiglons, which I think is the weirdest name, which is a hybrid between lions and tigers. These don't exist in the wild. Now, we know they exist in a zoo setting because we've had tigers and lions mate, but they're ecologically isolated. So tigers and lions simply don't have ranges that overlaps in India. They use different habitats. So thus they don't encounter one another, and thus they don't mate with one another and produce offspring. Also, I think tiglons are just adorable. So that's ecological isolation. Behavioral isolation, the example I'll give you here is the blue-footed boobies. They select mates after an elaborate courtship display. Now, blue-footed boobies won't mate with other species of booby because they don't do the same elaborate dances that blue-footed boobies do. There's a fantastic video from David Attenborough's, I think it's Planet Earth, where it shows crazy mating dances of birds. I would recommend trying to find on YouTube. It's a really fun video to watch to see what the crazy dances that birds do look like. But that's behavioral isolation. Now, behavioral isolation is interesting. Now, sympatric species, so remember species that occupy the same ecological area, avoid mating with other members in a wide variety of ways by altering their visual signals, so how they court mates, by producing different sounds, so birds chirping, crickets with their little cricket sounds, but they also produce different types of chemical as well as electrical signals that make them distinct from species occupying the same habitat. So that's how behavioral isolation works. Now, we can actually see this in lacewings. Now, you might have seen a lacewing before in your life, or maybe you haven't. They're kind of intimidating when you first see them because they're pretty big. And we don't see a lot of big insects here in Massachusetts, but lacewings can be kind of big. Now, lacewings themselves rely on auditory signals, so they do these little chirps. And females have the capacity to distinguish between calls from different species. Now, this is just behavioral isolation, but we can look at 3 distinct species of lacewings, and we can look at the amplitude in decibels of their mating calls, and we can look at the time in seconds of their mating calls. And you can see between these 3 distinct species, they're the same genus, right? They're Chrysoperia something. They all have distinct mating calls, right? And it's very easy for this species to distinguish from this species and this species because the amplitude of their calls and the length of their calls are very, very different. So this is a type of behavioral isolation. Now, temporal isolation, again, occurs when you occupy the same area, but you reproduce at different times of the year. So, for instance, there are 2 species of wild lettuce. They grow along roadsides in the United States in the southeast. Wild lettuce looks really ugly. I forgot to put a picture, but you can Google what wild lettuce looks like. It's really ugly. The hybrids can be experimentally made in the laboratory setting, but they're very, very rare in nature because one type of lettuce flowers in early spring and the other flowers in the summer. Thus, they are temporally isolated from producing a hybrid. Now, mechanical isolation is, again, the structure of the male and females, penis and vagina, have to be compatible. They have to. Now, bees actually are an interesting example of this. Now, bees carry pollen of one species on certain places of their bodies. However, if this area does not come in contact with the receptive structures of a flower of another plant species, the pollen actually can't pollinate another one. So that's kind of an interesting, again, penis shape and vagina shape is also a great example of mechanical isolation. But bees, again, are also another great example. Prevention of gamete fusion is another one. So simply your gametes can't match up. So animals that shed gametes directly into water, the eggs and sperm derived from different species actually cannot physically attract or fuse with one another. So if I have a species of frog and another species of frog, if the sperm of that frog meets the egg of that other frog, they simply can't fuse with one another. Just doesn't happen. Now, after we produce an egg, so pretend all happens well and an egg is produced. I'm sorry, I need 1 second. Give me just 1 second. My dog is being a pain in the butt. So just give me 1 second. I'll be right back. So sorry about that. Puppies are a pain in the butt. Okay, so let's pretend that 2 distinct species, they actually have and produce a viable egg. So this is what we call post-zygotic. So the egg has been fertilized. Now, an example of this is actually our friends, well, maybe you don't consider your friends, but they are our friends. They're called leopard frogs. Now, they form a group of related species. They were initially thought to be one species, but we now know there's many, many species of leopard frogs. Now, when they do produce offspring, it's kind of an interesting phenomena. They produce eggs that develop However, the hybrids that are produced between species of leopard frogs actually um, can be, so that you can't produce, let me take a step back. So problems occur as the fertilized eggs begin to develop, and so they kind of just don't produce viable offspring at the end of the day. So the hybrids that do produce between species of frogs simply don't survive particularly well, and they're typically overall weaker. And commonly, we also see with hybrids between two species, they're typically sterile. And a great example of this is mules. Now, mules display are hybrids between horses and donkeys, and they display a couple interesting things, including abnormal sex organs, failure to form gametes, and they also have issues with chromosomes being unable to properly pair in meiosis. And again, the leopard frog is a great example of this. There's 4 distinct species of leopard frog. They occupy different areas. When you bring them together and you have individuals, it's difficult. But when they do actually fertilize the eggs of one another, they simply just don't produce strong and viable offspring. Now, that's the biological species concept, solely dependent on the capacity to produce viable offspring for the next generation. However, this species concept does not explain all observations. Now, critics of this concept argue that reproductive isolation might not be the only force maintaining species integrity. And this is criticized by what we call interspecific hybridization. So, for instance, 50% of California plant species were not really well defined by genetic isolation. So even though they were distinct species, a lot of them could produce hybrids between them. So not a great reinforcement of the biological species concept. In addition, 10% of the 10,000 plus species of birds are actually known to hybridize in nature. So it's not perfect, and clearly there's something wrong with it. But this does lead to the development of what we call the ecological species concept, where each species is adapted to its environment. And so it doesn't rely so much on your capacity to produce offspring, but it's simply what ecological niche or breadth of ecological conditions do you operate under. Now, the distinctions among and between species are maintained by natural selection. A process called stabilizing selection maintains the species adaptations. And we discussed what stabilizing selection looked like in the last lecture. Hybrids are quickly eliminated from the gene pool. And finally, in some cases, strong selection overwhelms gene flow, simply not letting genes mix between populations. Now, what other weaknesses are there of the biological species concept? Well, it's actually really difficult to apply this concept to microscopic organisms. So I'm sure you guys have all heard of E. coli. You guys might also have heard of tuberculosis. Those are 2 distinct genetic species of bacteria. Bacteria don't mate, right? They're asexual. So how does the ecological or even the biological species concept apply to things that are asexual, like bacteria or yeast or species of fungi, right? It doesn't quite apply. Okay? It's also very difficult to apply this concept to populations that are geographically separated in nature, right? They simply just don't come across one another, right? They just don't come across, right? So how do we know that the concept exists there? In addition, many species that don't hybridize in the wild will actually do so in captivity, right? So tigers and lions don't hybridize in the wild, but you bring them into a zoo and they will hybridize. And there's also this idea that there's potentially different processes that maintain species identity in different organisms. So maybe it's not just reproduction. Maybe there's other mechanisms that we just simply don't know of. Which might lead us to thinking, well, maybe natural selection has a root in reproductive isolation. So we can ask the question, how does one ancestral species become divided into 2 descendant species? Well, we can answer this question, but the first thing I'd like to state is that potentially if one species is defined by the existence of reproductive isolation, then processes of speciation is identical to the evolution of reproductive isolating mechanisms. Which means that if what separates 2 species of insect is the shape of their genitals, well, there has to be an evolutionary natural selection based track to lead to the development of 2 different sets of genitals. So that's what we're getting at there. Now, selection itself might also reinforce these isolating mechanisms. Now, the formation of species is not just like a one and done process. It takes time. It doesn't just happen overnight. It takes an extended period of time for a species to split into two distinct populations and then become two distinct species. Now, two populations themselves may only be partially reproductively isolated, as we see with, say, like the lion and the tiger. However, we can have this process which we call reinforcement, and I have a great example of this in the next slide. But reinforcement we define as being initially incomplete, incompletely isolating mechanisms are then reinforced by natural selections until they are completely effective. So if you have a slight variation in mating calls, natural selection reinforces that mating call changes or differences over time. Now, reinforcement, as I sort of have been alluding to, is not inevitable. Hybrids might actually be inferior, but might still be fertile. It may actually serve as a conduit of genetic exchange between two distinct species or two species that are becoming extinct. So let's look at Phylox. It's a species of flower. Now, Drummond's Phylox is light blue with a pink tinge. And so you can see, our Phylox here. Now, in areas where it is sympatric with pointed Phylox, so in this case you can see pointed Phylox is here in yellow, Drummond's Phylox is here in red. And you can see flower shape is distinct between these two, and color is also distinct with these two. So now, there are areas where they are sympatric. So Drummond Phylox is sympatric with pointed Phylox, as you see here in purple. Now, in those areas, it is deep red so that the butterflies that pollinate with the flowers actually can distinguish between the two species, which is kind of cool, right? So you have these species, slightly different phenotypes or traits in different areas, but when they occupy a similar range, they take on a slightly different color so that they're easily distinguishable for their pollinators. So this is an example of reinforcement. Right? Different species, they're sympatrically occupying the same thing, and selection is reinforcing the differences between the species because, in this case, remember, what makes flowers be able to reproduce? It's insects. And if you want to attract the right insects, you have to have the right colors. So I think that's a pretty cool thing. Now, genetic drift, as we discussed, remember genetic drift being random changes in the genetics of a population, they also might cause reproductive isolation. Now, genetic drift is common on big and small populations, but remember, genetic drift is strongest in small populations. And there are random changes outside genetic drift. So remember, we have founder effects and population bottlenecks. Those might also cause reproductive isolation in species. Now, an example of this is actually in the Hawaiian Islands. Now, Drosophila, so our fruit flies, also differ in courtship behavior. Now, the changes in courtship behavior between the ancestor and the descendant population in Hawaiian Islands actually seems to be a result of founder events. So what was going on? There's an ancestral population in the mainland, whether it's in Asia or North America, and the Hawaiian Islands are a pretty remote island chain. So they had to be brought to the Hawaiian Islands, and once they got to the Hawaiian Islands, selection took over, leading to different courtship behaviors because the Hawaiian Islands are different, naturally speaking, than the mainland in either China or Asia, I should say, and North America. So again, founder effect inducing changes in behaviors, which in turn lead to potential speciation events. Adaptation itself can also lead to speciation. An adaptation just meaning that you're adapting to your environment, right? Your environment has this condition, you are adapting to it, so you're better able to survive. You have higher ecological fitness in that environment. So as populations of a species adapt to different circumstances, they likely accumulate many differences that may potentially lead to reproductive isolation. So as we discussed with the foxes earlier in this lecture, trying to domesticate a fox based upon its behavior also led to other changes. So an example of this is actually dewlap color in lizards. So dewlaps are these long skin that lizards have on their throat. They essentially extend them and retract them in mating courtships. Just as a note, that's how dewlaps work. It's not the most exciting courtship, but that's just how lizards attract mates. Now, dewlap color in lizards helps them be recognized by members of their own species. Now, if you can't be seen by extending your dewlap, you simply don't mate. And so by having this adaptation to, if I'm going to mate, I need to be seen. So it means I have to change my, or I have to select for dewlap colors. Well, this could potentially lead to reproductive isolation from an ancestral population. So kind of a cool thing. And this is what dewlaps look like. Again, they're not the most exciting thing in the world, but they're a great example of potentially what adapting to your environment might look like, where you can have 4 different species of lizards here. They all have different sizes and colors and patterns on their dewlaps, which leads to different species, because this dewlap wouldn't attract this species and this dewlap wouldn't attract this species, right? So different environments lead to different dewlaps, which in turn lead to different behavioral rituals, which in turn lead to separation of species. Now, geography also plays a really large role in speciation. And speciation is in itself a 2-part process. The first, identical populations have to diverge in some way. Right? You can't have a new species form, typically speaking, if they're not diverged, either ecologically or via space. Right? They have to be separated some way, whether it's by their behavior or their ecology or by physical space. And then for 2 species to exist, reproductive isolation has to evolve to maintain those differences. Now, speciation itself is very much more likely in geographically isolated populations. Now, geographically isolated populations can mean a number of different things. Geographically isolated like islands, geographically isolated by, say, a river. So if you're something very small like an insect, a river might be an impenetrable barrier, right? Or geographically isolated, like you think like a mountain range, right? It's hard to cross mountains, even for things that are adapted for living on mountains. So mountains are a great way to geographically isolate individuals, thus creating new environments for species to separate. Now, geographic isolation leads us to what we call allopatric speciation, which is where geographically separated, or what we deem as allopatric populations, appear more likely to have evolved substantial differences leading to speciation. Because again, geographically isolated implies potentially different environmental conditions. And remember, different environmental conditions lead to potentially different species. So the little paradise kingfisher varies little throughout its normal range. However, isolated populations of kingfishers, which are just birds on islands, are actually strikingly different from each other on a mainland population. So we can look at this. This is the island of New Guinea. We have the mainland population of kingfishers that look like this. But on islands, which are isolated, not super isolated, but still isolated enough that it prevents a lot of gene flow between the main island and these subsequent islands, allows these species to evolve. And how are they evolving? Again, they're adapting to their environment, which is leading to the change in their biology. Again, leading to wide variability and different species of kingfishers. Beautiful birds, by the way. They're at zoos every now and then. So now that's allopatric speciation, but we discussed sympatric speciation, right, where we have 2 species forming in a similar geographic area in a single location. Now, one of the common ways we actually see speciation occurring within the same environment is actually through a process called polyploidy, where individuals have more than 2 sets of chromosomes. Now, there are different types of polyploidy out there. So the first is autoploidy, where all of the chromosomes have arisen from a single species, And this occurs during errors during cellular division, producing tetraploids, so i.e. having 4 copies of each chromosome instead of having 2 copies of each chromosome. And they actually physically cannot produce fertile offspring with normal diploids. So they have this zygotic um, incompatibility with one another. So that's autoploidy. Now, allopolyploidy, where 2 species hybridize, so tiger and lion, and the resulting offspring have 1 copy of each chromosome from each species. Now, typically speaking, these are infertile. They can't reproduce with other species because the chromosomes simply don't pair correctly during meiosis. However, they can become fertile if the chromosomes spontaneously doubled, i.e. polyploidy, so autoploidy, and then they could potentially breed with other tetraploids. So again, it's kind of this funky genetic mechanism, but this is what it's looking like, right? Where we have the species 1 and species 2, there's a parental generation, and they produce offspring. So the 2n is 4, the 2n is 6 here. Now they produce gametes that have n equals 2 and n equals 3. Now, if we have that hybrid generation, a couple things can happen. We have no doubling of the chromosome number, which means the chromosomes either cannot pair or go through erratic meiosis, thus the production of sterile individuals or no gametes. Or there's a chromosome doubling, which now allows pairing during meiosis, thus producing viable gametes and sexual reproduction that is possible with other tetraploids. So you can have this, again, this is thinking about how do new species arrive within sympatric populations, right? Species living together in the same area. Now, sympatric speciation can also occur via disruptive selection. Now, excuse me. So sympatric speciation can occur over the course of multiple generations through disruptive selection. This causes a population that contains individuals exhibiting 2 distinct phenotypes. Now, these 2 phenotypes would have to evolve reproductive isolating mechanisms, and these 2 phenotypes could also be retained as polymorphism within a single population. So our disruptive selection, something causing a complete disruption in the distribution of a traits in a population, can also lead to distinctive populations. Now, this idea of allopatric versus sympatric speciation actually seems to be not all that common, right? We think that sympatric speciation is relatively rare, and allopatric speciation is by far the most common mechanism of speciation. However, we do know there are examples of sympatric speciation. So for instance, palm trees on Lord Howe Island, island in the Pacific. 2 species of palms, both found on the island and adapted to living on different types of soil. So they live together, but adapted to just 2 distinct environments. Now, given the small size of the island and that the pollen of the trees is dispersed by wind, there's actually little opportunity for divergence, but there is 2 distinct species. So this is like an example of sympatric speciation, again, all driven by differences in soil properties. Now, we can also have what's called adapted radiation, and we've actually sort of discussed this already, but we didn't give it a name yet. Whereas adaptive radiation happens when closely related species have recently evolved from a common ancestor by adapting to different parts of the environment. Now, when we just talked about the Galapagos finches, how did that come to be? Well, they came from the mainland, they landed on the Galapagos, and there was all these different habitats present on the Galapagos. And so the birds evolved into different species occupying all these different environments on the Galapagos. And that's what adaptive radiation is. Fanning out to occupy all these different niches present. And so that happens like when you have a foundational species, as we saw with the Galapagos, but we can also see that effect when a catastrophic event occurs. Now, a catastrophic event, say like a hurricane or a tornado or a severe drought, could cause other things to go locally extinct, and which could lead for the radiation of another species to fill those habitats. So that's adaptive radiation. Now we also have this really cool phenomenon called key innovation, where a new trait evolves within a species, allowing it to use resources that were previously inaccessible. Now we see this a couple different times throughout our evolutionary trajectory as, a planet. Now we see the evolution of lungs in fish, which allows fish to move from the water to the land. We also see the evolution of wings independently in both birds and insects, which allow them to take advantage of not just being on ground or on surfaces, but to take to the air and occupy that now available resource. Now, these processes, again, they're innovation, but they allow you to potentially also move to other places, right? Potentially, the capacity for flight allows you to move to islands. But again, this idea of innovation allows you to pick up potentially new traits and allow you potentially to adapt to new environments, take advantage of new things, thus potentially leading rise to brand new species. Now, we also see what's called character displacement, where two reproductively isolated but ecologically similar species come into contact. Now, natural selection in each species favors those individuals that use resources not used by other species. So natural selection inherently doesn't like species to compete, at least not over all their resources that they are using, which is kind of makes sense to an extent, right? You want, competition, is not exactly the best thing, right? If you're competing with another species, you're expending lots of other resources. Now, natural selection in each species that are reproductively isolated but ecologically similar favors those, gives a few things. So the first gives her greater fitness. It also gives trait differences in resource usage that will increase in frequency over time, thus leading to divergence of species. So we can look at this. So the frequency of body size as a trait. We have species 1 and species 2. Now, natural selection tells us that these individuals probably shouldn't reproduce with compete with one another. And so natural selection selects for the extremes in body size, thus minimizing competition. And so over time, displacement tells us that the frequency of traits in species A and species B will drive them apart in terms of their biology, thus leading to two distinct species where there's not a whole lot of overlap in terms of a trait that might make them compete. It's kind of a weird phenomenon, right? You have, competition is inevitable for lots of things, but natural selection actually tries to avoid competition as a mechanism, simply because, simply because we, it's not in the best interest to compete with another species. Now, we actually see examples of character displacement in three-spined sticklebacks. Now, this is what a three-spined stickleback looks like. They're these tiny little fish, but they're great organisms to understand evolution. They're great model organisms. Now, evolution of differences of in three-spined sticklebacks has occurred in two populations to minimize their competition for food. Now, one species of stickleback is actually adapted to using open water. It has more effective gill structures and a more streamlined body. And the other is adapted to foraging margins and the bottom of the lake. So foraging margins being like the edge of lakes and stuff like that. And they have stouter bodies and altered mouth shapes. And we can see this, right? We have these much more narrow-bodied sticklebacks, better for open water. And then we have these guys, I don't know, this guy looks kind of like a derp to me. They both kind of look like derps, but this guy in particular looks like a derp to me, where it has very different biology, right? It's not as streamlined, it's thicker, its mouth parts are different. Again, occupying the same area, but occupying different ecological roles. Now, as I mentioned, we see adaptive radiation in island organism. An example I mentioned earlier is the Hawaiian Drosophila, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that explanation now. Now, Drosophila, or just fruit flies, we know that greater than 1,000 species of Drosophila exist on the Hawaiian Islands alone. That might sound like a lot, but there are currently about 90,000 species of flies on this planet. So it's not, it's not a ton of species, just as a note. Now, on the Hawaiian Islands, there's a wide variety of morphological and behavioral traits that have evolved on Drosophila. And what's happening here is that empty habitats that were encountered by the ancestor of modern species of Drosophila resulted in fruit flies that are predators, parasites, herbivores, detritivores, and nectar eaters. Now, the vast majority of Drosophila, um, at least the ancestral population, would have likely mostly just been detritivores, but because it was encountering brand new ecological habitats, it led it to speciation for Drosophila now that are predators and parasites and so on and so forth. So kind of a cool thing. Now you can also see difference in body shapes. So you can have the predatory Drosophila over here. You can see its eyes have evolved quite differently to give it better vision and a slightly more streamlined body shape. And then you could have a wild Drosophila that's more of a, like a detritivore that's got a much different body shape, much more different habitat, much different behavior. So pretty cool. Now we can also see um, a group of organisms called lobiads. Um, this is what lobiads look like. They're plants. They're not the most exciting. Well, actually, I think these are pretty cool. You might not think they're exciting, but I think they're pretty exciting. Now, these are a group of 125 distinct species, and they have radiated to produce a wide variety of plants, including vines, shrubs, and even small trees. And they do this by inhabiting cliffsides, high elevation bogs, rainforests, deserts, and even coastlines. Again, adaptively radiating to fill all the available different habitats on the Hawaiian island. Now, you might not think it by looking at these, but they're all the same genus of organisms, different species, but they've adaptively radiated to occupy different habitats, thus leading to different species. And these species have different characteristics. Never in a million years would you think this and this was the same genus, would you? I wouldn't. I know they are because obviously I pulled these slides together, but just by looking at it, they don't look quite like they would be related, but they really are, which I think is a remarkable feature of adaptive radiation. We all already talked about Darwin's finches and how they adaptively radiated to the Galapagos Islands. Now remember, when we think about how Darwin's finches adaptively radiated to the islands, they adapted to different food, whether it was cacti, whether it was seeds on the ground, whether it was living in trees, whether it was living on buds on branches. It didn't matter. They evolved and they adapted to eating different food sources, which in turn led to their adaptive radiation into the 13 distinct species we know on the Galapagos Islands. And you can actually physically see this, right? So we know we have all these distinct species of finches on the Galapagos Islands. Remember, one species of finch landed back there, millions of years ago, and adapted to all these different environments. It adaptively radiated on the Galapagos, occupying different habitats, eating different food sources, leading to the selection of different traits. And as selection selected for different traits for those different habitats, it in turn led to the speciation of these finches within the same location, sometimes on the same island. But again, it's adapting to different habitats that are available. I'm going to skip this example because I think that's enough examples of adaptive radiation. But if you want to learn about how cichlids, as fish, adaptively radiated in Lake Victoria in Africa, it's a pretty cool example. But I think we've had enough examples of adaptive radiation for the day. Now, evolution has varying levels of pace. Now, we have what's called gradualism, and this is how Darwin thought evolution occurred. But gradualism tells us that there's accumulation of small changes over time, and where there's a long-term goal of evolution. That's what gradualism means. Now, we can also have punctuated equilibrium, where we have long periods of stasis, i.e. no change, followed by very rapid evolutionary changes. So you can kind of think of it as like oscillating, where you have basically no change, then you have really rapid change, and then you basically have no change. And kind of like this back and forth like of a wave. And we can kind of see, what this looks like. Now, gradualism, we kind of just accumulate species over time, right? The changes occur over time, eventually, gradually leading to two distinct species. Punctuated equilibrium tells us, well, nothing happens, and then bam, new species. Or bam, new traits. And then, time goes on, nothing happens, and then bam, new trait, potentially new species, and so on and so forth. So that's what punctuated equilibrium is. They're kind of at both ends of the spectrum. And then there's this kind of other in-between one. I'll just make a note of where evolution is kind of always rapidly happening. So we know viruses, this is the case where evolution is always happening, and it's happening very rapidly. Same thing for bacteria. Very rapid evolution all the time. But for big things, it follows either into gradualism or punctuated equilibrium. So for instance, the grants, when we talked about them earlier in this lecture, where they had rapid evolution of beak sizes due to drought, that was an example of punctuated equilibrium. Now, we know that not everything that has ever lived on this planet is still living with us, right? We know there are fossils of things that are no longer on this planet. However, we also know that there are things that have gone extinct in our lifetime. So, for instance, the dodo bird is a great example of this, something that used to exist on the planet, but has been driven to extinction, i.e. it no longer exists on this planet. Now, speciation and extinction go hand in hand with one another. Now, speciation leads to the creation of new species, and we know that biological diversity, since oxygen as a molecule really expanded in the atmosphere about 600 million years ago, we know diversity has greatly expanded in the previous 600 million years. And along that 600-year rise in biological diversity, we also know there's been sharp declines in species. And there's this kind of interesting phenomena where there's this kind of what we call mass extinctions, where species are increasing in richness, or there's many more species accumulating over time. And then there's this massive, massive die-off. And so we know that through geological time, there has been 5 mass extinctions that have occurred. And a mass extinction is simply defined as greater than 20% of all species on the planet going extinct at one time. Now, it's 20%. The maximum we've ever observed was actually 96% of all species going extinct, not simultaneously, but over a very short period of time. So these are what we call mass extinctions. We know there's been 5 of them. The last mass extinction that occurred was the one that killed off the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. That was a relatively small mass extinction. Only about 23% of all animals went extinct. So, however, we are actually in the middle of the 6th great mass extinction right now. And why is that? It's not because an asteroid is coming or volcanoes are going crazy. It's actually because of humans. And we'll talk about this idea of the 6th mass extinction later in the semester, but do know we are currently in the middle of another great mass extinction because of how awful humans treat this planet. But we can actually physically look at this mass extinctions over time. Now, this is the number of biological families, and this is the millions of years ago. And we can look at how these families accumulate over time. So we see that they accumulate, some leave over an extended period of time. But then you see our first mass extinction here, where we have this huge drop. We lose hundreds of millions of species here, and then they recover, and then we have the next one, and they kind of recover, and then we lose, and so on and so forth, right? So we have, but you see that we're continuously accumulating species over time, but there are these great extinctions where we wipe out huge proportions of the species on the planet. And again, we are currently here, but again, we're on one of these big downward trends. It's unclear how big the current mass extinction is going to be, but if we keep going at the pace that we're going at, it's going to rival some of our largest extinctions that we have ever seen. But again, speciation and extinction are tied together. Just because things go extinct, as you can see here, doesn't mean that species aren't going to rise to fill the empty voids. Remember, that's kind of what species do, right? If there's an open ecological area, something will rise to fill that open ecological area. And as it does, natural selection will act upon it, thus creating new species. So that's going to be the end of today's lecture. I know that was quite a bit of talk about species and all that fun stuff, but again, it's a foundational topic for thinking about evolution. What is a species? How do you define it? How does natural selection create new species? How do we define species? And how does species arise in geographically distinct as well as geographically similar areas? So that's going to be it for